Toward the end of my airline career, I checked out and flew the DC-10 for my last 14 years, I think, as a captain. And our route system was such that I flew the airplane, well, domestically, obviously, but for the most part, out in the Pacific initially. Flew Asia as far west as Hong Kong, up several cities in Japan, down to Indonesia, Australia, Fiji Islands, Nandi, and Tahiti, and later I bid to fly Europe and South America out of the East Coast, Europe. As I said, I flew the airplane for 14 years. We had the Series 10 DC-10 and a Series 30, the long-range airplane, which had fewer seats, but another 145,000 pounds of fuel, as I recall, for longer range trips. Gross weight was something like max taxi, I think, was 585,000 pounds, where the Dash 10 was 433,000 something. I'm going back a lot of years to remember those numbers. At any rate, I enjoyed flying the airplane very much. It started off with some real problems due to maintenance in the case of a DC-10 crash coming out of Chicago. They were taking the engines off for maintenance in a unapproved manner, I think, with the pylon being taken off with the engine, and so that led to a problem on takeoff for a carrier out of O'Hare. They lost everybody on the airplane, and then there were other problems. I think a Turkish airplane out of Paris headed somewhere, and there was a design problem initially with the locking feature, or the safety of the locking on the aft cargo door. And when that Turkish airplane, the cargo door came open, it wasn't latched properly, and as I recall, the pressurization, they were at an altitude where the venting of the cabin pressure collapsed the floor, and the hydraulic lines, the airplane controls were hydraulic, and they lost that airplane as well, with considerable loss of life. And I think American had another problem, but the pilots managed to get the airplane on the ground using the autopilot after a cargo door opened. But by the time I got on it, they had worked out that cargo door problem, and no further problems with the airplane. It was a joy to fly it. Huge windows on the thing, and just a great view as you were flying the airplane. It was very quiet cockpit design, very little noise. You could carry a normal conversation in the cockpit. 5 seats in the airplane, normal crew, flight engineer, and then 2 jump seats. And quite frequently we'd have commuters, and you could hear anybody in the cockpit easily at cruise speed, which was normally, we flew the airplane about 0.83, I think, for fuel economy. But as I said, I flew the Pacific, Europe, and South America on the airplane. The longer flights I flew, I remember, would be something around 11 hours, maybe slightly more, from JFK to Honolulu. That's the longest leg I flew, and in the wintertime, fighting the winds, it, I recall, would sometimes take over 11 hours, which was quite a distance back in those days. Now it's common for the newer airplanes to fly 14, 16 hours. But with two crews. But back in those days, if we were scheduled to fly more than what was it? I think if we were scheduled to fly more than something like 11 hours, we had to take another pilot, and as a relief, he would be qualified in both pilot positions and flight engineer positions as far as in flight, no landings and takeoffs, but we called him an international relief officer, which we would on the longer flights use those. The Dash 10 was, as I mentioned, I think capacity was about 300 people. Very, very little difference in flying that I can recall. The DC-10 and the Series 30, you would know from the weights, of course, and the takeoff speeds and that sort of thing, that you were in the different airplane. But as far as flying the airplane, there was very little difference that I can recall. It was an airplane that performed well. I remember I hadn't been on the airplane 3 weeks probably, and taking off out of Los Angeles from Honolulu in a baby 10, a Dash 10, and I recall 300 souls on board, and brand new flight engineer. Like I say, I'd been on the airplane 2 or 3 weeks, and we were taking off, I think 2-4 left to right out of LAX, and we had just passed VR, rotation speed, and the flight engineer said, "Captain, we've got a fire on the #1 engine." And I thought, oh boy, this is going to be fun, you know, just got on the airplane. So I remember telling them, look, we're not going to touch anything until we've got the gear up and got the airplane at least partially cleaned up. So we got the gear up and flaps, and came back on the power. The procedure was to reduce power in case you had a problem. It might not be an engine fire, it might just be a bleed leak or something like that, and the fire warning would go out, and in this case that didn't happen, so we went through the complete shutdown. A captain on a pass had come up into the cockpit just to say hello, introduce himself, and so I knew he was in the back, and once I had the airplane cleaned up and we were out over the water, I told Center that, well, probably earlier than that, I think I had the first officer tell air traffic control that we had a problem and would be returning for landing, but we would have to get down to landing weight. And but to make sure this fire was out, the fire warning system went out, and so I didn't think we had a fire, but I still wanted the thing looked at. So being new on the airplane, I stayed in the cockpit and I asked for that captain to come up so I could talk to him, and the flight attendant went back and got him. And I asked him to go back as unobtrusively as possible and look at the engine for me and tell me if he saw any indications of heat or any sorts of damage to the engine, the sail or whatnot. And he did, and came back up and said it looked normal. In fact, he said he didn't even know we had shut the engine down. We did it smoothly. And I think went up to 10,000 feet, told Center I wanted to dump fuel, as I mentioned. Dumped 60,000 pounds of fuel, and came back in for a landing. Being new on the airplane, I wanted to do all the flying, so I remember I had the first officer make the PAs. He was well qualified, and as I mentioned, the second officer, the flight engineer, was his first or second trip, And he did a really good job, having just come out of the simulator, doing these things constantly in training. And but I remember the one thing he didn't do right is get the flap settings. With one engine shut down, we didn't go to full landing flaps. It was a lesser position on the flaps, and he figured the numbers wrong. But I called him on that, so we did that properly. And I remember it was one of my better landings, and it felt good that I didn't know I had the airplane on the ground until I started pushing forward on the yoke. And I could, when I closed the throttles, I remember hearing applause all the way from the cabin up into the cockpit, which gave me a nice feeling. But the airplane performed very well on 2 engines with a full load and Hawaii fuel. So I was most impressed with the airplane's performance. I had a few other problems through the years with the airplane: engine shutdowns, inadvertent engine shutdowns, constant speed drives. One of the more interesting problems I had was flying from Guam to Indonesia, Bali. We had a light come on, start valve light started flickering on, and in some airplanes, if the start valve opened with the engine turning, you had a real problem. And but as I mentioned, this light was just flickering, and so not knowing quite what to do, there was no indication, any abnormals on the manual on what to do in a case like that. I had the flight engineer try and contact our dispatch in the States, and as I mentioned, we were well past Palau, probably approaching Sulawesi on the way to Bali, and on single sideband.
For our layman viewers, are you just ocean every direction?
Yes, well, there are islands all over the place in the Pacific, South Pacific, but yeah, we were over the ocean, certainly. And normally going down there, the alternate was in the Philippines. I forget the name of the place. It's where one of the, I think Magellan was killed by the natives there in the Philippines, but I can't remember the alternate's name right now. At any rate, we raised Houston maintenance dispatch, and I got maintenance on the radio, and they researched the problem and told me that there were no worries. Even if the start valve had opened, it would not have damaged the engine. And so we continued on to Bali and landed uneventfully and got the thing. I think it was an electrical problem, a wire shorted or something like that. After we landed in Bali, maintenance took care of it. I don't even think we were delayed that long, perhaps a couple of hours, something. And that's all those years of flying the airplane. I had just very few maintenance problems that weren't easily handled. You had so many redundant systems on the airplane that you could take care of most anything. It was just, to me, a wonderful airplane after the initial bugs were worked through.
Do you recall that that DC-10 that had the center engine on the vertical stabilizer explode or something like that? And those pilots had to...
Yes, that was the Sioux City, Iowa accident, and as I mentioned earlier, the airplane had hydraulic system that were the way you controlled, no cables, just all hydraulics for the flight surfaces. That's how you control the airplane. and that engine came apart in such a manner. One of the compressor wheels, or either I don't recall whether it was a low pressure, high pressure turbine wheels in the back of the engine, came apart and damaged the one of the hydraulic systems, which led to a leakage, and they lost all their hydraulic fluid. So the only way to control the airplane was with the engines, and they did a good job of it. But there were stories about there was someone else in the cockpit, a check airman or something, that pulled the power back at the last moment, and which was the wrong thing to do. The airplane reacted adversely and caused it to cartwheel and catch on fire. At any rate, that's all conjecture. I don't know that to be a fact. I've never read the accident report. So, but anyway, that was the one and only time that I think all three hydraulic systems failed on the airplane. Normally there was a fail-safe system in the thing, so you could lose one and still have the other two and control the airplane. But somehow that was the one area where they lost all the hydraulics that control the airplane from the cockpit, that allowed you to control the flight controls from the cockpit.